This video contains a fictional story created for entertainment and inspiration. The narrative is original, created with the assistance of AI tools and human creative review. No real events or historical facts are being presented as true. The season of 1843 would be remembered in London society not for its scandals, though there were plenty, nor for its brilliant matches, though several were made. It would be remembered because of a single evening in late May, when the Duchess of Marlborough opened her ballroom doors to 300 of England's finest families, and two people who should never have mattered to each other discovered that sometimes destiny cares nothing for propriety. Amelia Brookstone had not wanted to attend. She stood before the modest mirror in her rented rooms on the unfashionable side of Mayfair, studying her reflection with the practiced objectivity of someone who had long ago stopped hoping for miracles. The dress she wore was pale blue muslin, simple in cut, devoid of the elaborate embellishments that marked this season's fashions. It had belonged to her mother once, before illness and debt had stripped their family of everything but dignity. She had altered it herself over the course of 3 evenings, letting out seams her mother's slighter frame had required, adding fresh ribbon at the waist because the original had frayed beyond repair. Her needle-pricked fingers testified to the labor involved in making something old appear presentable if not fashionable. The dress was respectable. It was appropriate. It was also, by every measure that mattered in London society, inadequate. Amelia studied the neckline, wondering if she should have added lace to disguise its plainness. But lace cost money she did not have, and borrowing from Charlotte felt like accepting charity she could never repay. She had already accepted so much: the room she occupied, the food she ate, the very invitation that would allow her entry to the Marlborough ball. Adding requests for decorative trim seemed like excessive presumption. Her cousin Charlotte, who had sponsored Amelia's reluctant entry into society, had tried to insist upon lending her something more suitable. Amelia had refused with a firmness that bordered on rudeness. She could accept charity in the form of an invitation, a roof over her head, the introductions that gave her access to ballrooms she could never have entered on her own merit. But she would not accept pity disguised as silk and Belgian lace. If she were to attend the Duchess of Marlborough's ball, she would do so as herself, exactly as she was, without pretense or apology. The decision felt less like pride and more like a form of protection. If she appeared in borrowed finery, she might begin to hope. She might allow herself to imagine that she belonged among women whose gowns cost more than her father's entire annual income had been. And hope, Amelia had learned through bitter experience, was the cruelest indulgence a woman in her position could afford. She pinned a single silk flower, salvaged from one of her mother's old bonnets, into her hair and forced herself to look away from the mirror. Dwelling on her inadequacies served no useful purpose. She would attend the ball because refusing would hurt Charlotte's feelings. She would stand at the margins, observe the spectacle, and return home having fulfilled her obligation without exposing herself to the particular humiliation of hoping for anything more. They arrived late, which was unintentional, but perhaps fitting. The hired carriage Charlotte had arranged broke a wheel on the cobblestones near Hyde Park, requiring them to wait in the damp evening air while repairs were made. Charlotte fretted endlessly, certain they had missed all opportunity for proper introductions, convinced that arriving after the receiving line had dissolved would mark them as hopelessly provincial. But Amelia felt only relief. She could slip into the ballroom unnoticed, observe from the margins as she always did, and return home having fulfilled her obligation without the acute discomfort of being formally presented to a duchess whose name alone represented everything Amelia lacked. The moment they ascended the marble steps of Marlborough House, Amelia felt the familiar constriction in her chest that accompanied entering spaces where she did not belong. The entrance hall alone could have contained the entire cottage where she had spent her childhood. Footmen in elaborate livery lined the staircase, their expressions carefully neutral as they evaluated each arriving guest. She wondered if they could tell simply by looking which guests truly belonged and which were present only through the grace of more fortunate relations. The ballroom was everything the newspapers had promised, and Amelia's limited imagination had failed to fully conjure. Crystal chandeliers, at least a dozen of them, cast prismatic light across walls hung with cream silk and gilt-framed mirrors that multiplied the already overwhelming grandeur. The orchestra, positioned in an alcove draped with hothouse roses whose perfume reached even the ballroom's far corners, played a waltz with mathematical precision that spoke of hours of rehearsal. Ladies in jewel-toned satins and gentlemen in impeccable black evening dress moved through the figures of the dance, with the ease of people who had never questioned their right to occupy such spaces. The air itself seemed different here, perfumed not just with flowers, but with the particular confidence that came from knowing one's position in the world was secure, unassailable, permanent. Amelia took her customary place near a column at the room's edge, positioning herself where she could observe without obstruction, but remained outside the natural flow of social traffic. She had perfected this positioning over the few balls Charlotte had managed to secure invitations for, close enough to appear engaged, far enough to avoid the humiliation of standing obviously alone while others were claimed for dances. From this vantage point, she studied the scene with the attention of someone who understood she was witness to a world she would never truly inhabit. She watched young women her own age, 23 but infinitely more assured, laugh behind painted fans and cast appraising glances at eligible gentlemen. She observed mothers with marriageable daughters perform the delicate choreography of social advancement, maneuvering their charges into the paths of titled men with the strategic precision of military commanders positioning troops for battle. She saw fortunes being measured in the quality of jewels, bloodlines being evaluated through the correctness of curtsies, futures being negotiated through the seemingly innocent medium of dance cards and polite conversation. It was fascinating in the way a complex machine was fascinating, intricate, purposeful, functioning according to rules that governed every movement and interaction. She did not see Sebastian Rothwell notice her from across the room, though that single moment would alter both their lives irrevocably. Sebastian had not wanted to attend either. The Duke of Wetherham, as he was properly styled, had a well-earned reputation for avoiding social obligations he deemed frivolous, which was most of them. At 31, he had inherited his title 8 years earlier, following his father's sudden death from apoplexy, and had spent the intervening years managing estates spread across 3 counties, mediating disputes between tenants who had known his family for generations, and navigating the complex web of political and financial obligations that came with ancient titles and unfortunately modern debt. He attended Parliament faithfully, voted his conscience rather than his party affiliation, and had made himself generally unpopular among his peers by refusing to treat governance as an elaborate game played for personal advantage. His speeches on workers' housing and agricultural reform were thorough, well-researched, and thoroughly ignored by most of his fellow peers who found such concerns tediously practical. His refusal to marry had become a source of constant speculation in society. Every season brought a new crop of eligible young women whose mothers harbored elaborate ambitions of becoming the next Duchess of Wetherham. Every season, Sebastian demonstrated a polite but absolute disinterest in playing his assigned role in the marriage market. He was unfailingly courteous to the young women thrust into his path, remembered their names with the same diligence he applied to remembering tenant concerns, inquired after their interests with genuine curiosity, born of general politeness, and then failed entirely to take the next required steps toward courtship. He danced when social obligation demanded it, conversed when courtesy required it, and then retreated to his study to manage the concerns that actually interested him. Crop rotation schedules, the deteriorating condition of workers' housing on his northern properties, proposals for improving roads through his holdings, the possibility of establishing a school for tenant children. His grandmother, the formidable Dowager Duchess, had finally resorted to ultimatum: attend the Marlborough Ball or face her public displeasure, which would include pointed comments about irresponsibility, shirking duty, and the shame of allowing such an ancient and honourable name to die out for want of minimal effort. Sebastian, who loved his grandmother despite her relentless interference, had agreed. He would attend. He would be seen. He would dance precisely 3 obligatory dances with suitable young women his grandmother had undoubtedly pre-selected. And then he would leave, having fulfilled his promise without making any promises that actually mattered. He had been in the ballroom less than 20 minutes, enduring the practiced attentions of Lady Penelope Ashford, whose conversation consisted entirely of observations designed to demonstrate her suitability as a duchess, when he saw Amelia Brookstone for the first time. She stood alone near a column, partially obscured by the movement of other guests, wearing a dress so simple it seemed almost defiant in its lack of ornamentation. In a room where every woman competed for attention through increasingly elaborate displays of wealth and fashion, her simplicity created an unexpected focal point. Her hair, a shade darker than honey, was styled without the artifice that marked fashionable arrangements, pulled back to reveal a face that held none of the calculated prettiness society prized, but possessed something far more arresting: intelligence unguarded by coquetry, a quality of attention that suggested she saw everything while expecting to be seen by no one, and an expression of such careful composure that Sebastian immediately recognized it as armor against hurt. He found himself studying her with the focus he usually reserved for architectural drawings or agricultural reports, trying to understand what about her presence had captured his attention so thoroughly. She was not beautiful by conventional measures. Her features were too strong for fashionable delicacy, her expression too serious, her entire bearing lacking the soft compliance that marked marriageable young women. But there was something in the way she held herself, a quality of contained dignity that spoke of someone who had made peace with standing outside the circles others competed desperately to enter. She watched the assembled company with neither envy nor disdain, but with a kind of careful observation, as though cataloguing human behavior for some purpose he could not guess. Her stillness created a strange contrast to the movement surrounding her. While everyone else performed elaborate pantomimes of interest and desirability, she simply stood, entirely self-contained, honest in her separateness. Lady Penelope said something about the orchestra's excellence, or perhaps the magnificence of the floral arrangements, and Sebastian made what he hoped was an appropriate response, without removing his attention from the woman by the column. She had not moved, had not glanced around seeking conversation or company. She simply observed, and in a room full of performance, her refusal to perform felt like the only honest thing present. The waltz ended. Lady Penelope curtsied with practiced grace, he bowed with appropriate formality, and he found himself walking toward the column before he had consciously decided to move. It violated every rule of proper introduction. He had not been presented to her through mutual acquaintance. He had no legitimate excuse for approaching an unknown woman without proper social mediation. A duke crossing a crowded ballroom to address someone without introduction would provoke precisely the kind of gossip he had spent years carefully avoiding. He did it anyway. She did not notice his approach until he was standing directly before her, close enough that the noise of the ballroom receded slightly, and they occupied a small island of potential conversation. When she looked up, her eyes, grey or perhaps green in certain light he could not be certain, met his with a directness that suggested she had long ago decided that pretending to be less perceptive than she was served no useful purpose. "I apologize for the informality," Sebastian heard himself say, his voice lower than he intended, more urgent than seemed appropriate. "But I find myself in the unusual position of wanting to speak with you and having no notion of how to do so properly." Something flickered in her expression, not pleasure exactly, perhaps surprise or possibly suspicion, or maybe a combination of both, filtered through years of learning to expect disappointment. "Dukes generally find ways to accomplish what they want," she said. Her voice carried a slight tremor, as though she had not expected to speak at all tonight and was discovering her voice after a long silence. "Propriety bends around titles rather effectively. You know who I am. Everyone knows who you are, Your Grace. You are the most eligible man in England, and the source of much disappointed ambition among the mothers in attendance." There was no flirtation in her tone, no calculation, no attempt to charm or attract. She stated facts with the same directness she had studied the room. Sebastian found it unexpectedly refreshing, like cold water after hours in stifling heat. "And yet, you were not among those seeking introduction." "I do not flatter myself that I belong in that particular competition." She glanced down at her dress, the gesture neither apologetic nor self-deprecating, simply acknowledging reality. My presence here is an act of kindness by my cousin, not an indication that I harbor ambitions beyond my station." "Your station," he repeated, testing the word as though it were a concept he had never fully considered. "You say that as though it were decided by some authority we are all obliged to respect." Now her gaze sharpened, examining him with an attention that suggested she suspected mockery and was preparing to defend against it. "It is decided by birth, fortune, and circumstance, Your Grace. Some of us are not in a position to pretend otherwise. I am not pretending anything, Miss Brookstone, Amelia Brookstone." She did not curtsy, which should have been an offense, but instead felt like an acknowledgement of some truth neither of them had spoken. "And I think you must be pretending something, or you would not be speaking to me at all." He should have been offended. Any other woman in the room would have been horrified to have addressed him with such directness, would have immediately apologized and retreated behind proper deference. Instead, he felt something that had been dormant for longer than he cared to calculate. Interest. Genuine, uncomplicated curiosity about what she would say next, what she was thinking, who she actually was beneath the careful armor. "What would you guess I am pretending?" She considered the question seriously, studying him with the same careful attention she had given the ballroom earlier. Several seconds passed in silence that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow was not. "That you care about this. Any of it. The dancing, the gossip, the eternal performance of courtship that reduces people to assets and liabilities. I think you would rather be anywhere but here. And yet I came." "Yes," she said slowly, her expression revealing that she found this fact genuinely puzzling. "You did, which suggests either you have reasons you do not wish to explain, or you were compelled by obligation you could not refuse. Given that dukes are rarely compelled to do anything against their will, I assume the former." The orchestra had begun another waltz. Around them, couples moved into position with practiced ease, executing the practiced choreography of ballroom romance that had played out in similar rooms for generations. Sebastian realized with dim surprise that he had no interest in watching them, in fulfilling his obligation to dance with suitably ranked partners, in doing any of the things he had promised his grandmother would occupy his evening. He wanted only to continue this conversation with a woman whose name he had just learned and whose presence had accomplished the impossible, making him forget to perform the role society demanded. "Would you dance with me, Miss Brookstone?" For the first time, genuine emotion crossed her face. Shock, certainly, perhaps alarm, maybe a flicker of something that might have been hope if she had allowed herself to feel such things. "I do not think that would be wise, Your Grace. Wisdom is overrated. Easy to say when you risk nothing by flouting it." But her voice held less certainty now, suggesting she was arguing with herself as much as with him. "If you dance with me, people will notice. They will ask questions. They will assign significance where none exists. And when you return to your proper life tomorrow, having forgotten this impulse entirely, I will still be here. The subject of speculation and gossip I am ill-equipped to manage." Every word she spoke was true. He knew it with the certainty that came from years of observing how society functioned, how attention from people of rank affected those without similar protection. Any attention he paid her would be scrutinized, interpreted, weaponized by the social machinery that governed their world. As a duke, he could afford a single evening's eccentricity, could weather speculation and emerge unscathed. As an unknown woman of no fortune, she could not. "What if I told you I have no intention of forgetting this impulse? I would say you are either remarkably naive about your own nature, or you have mistaken me for someone who believes in fairy tales." She stepped back slightly, creating distance that felt both necessary and regrettable. "I thank you for your attention, Your Grace. It was unexpected. But I think you should return to the women who actually belong in your world." She turned to leave, moving with quiet dignity toward the ballroom's edge, where other wallflowers gathered in small clusters of mutual invisibility. Sebastian found himself following without conscious decision, aware that he was violating every principle of discretion he had cultivated over 8 years of managing public scrutiny, but unable to make himself care about consequences that seemed suddenly trivial. "Miss Brookstone," she stopped but did not turn, her shoulders tense with what might have been anticipation or dread. "I came to this ball tonight because my grandmother threatened public embarrassment if I did not. I had every intention of staying exactly long enough to fulfill my obligation and then retreating to my study, where I have correspondence regarding drainage systems in Yorkshire that genuinely interests me more than anything that happens in ballrooms." Now she turned, just slightly enough that he could see her profile. "And yet you are still here." "I am still here because you are here. And I find that I do not want to discuss drainage systems when I could be speaking with the only person in this room who appears to be as miserable about attending as I am." Something in her expression softened, not into pleasure, but into recognition, the acknowledgement of finding an unexpected kindred spirit in the least likely place. "We make quite a pair, then, two people who want to be elsewhere, trapped by obligation and circumstance. Perhaps we could be trapped together for one dance." He extended his hand, aware that dozens of eyes were tracking this interaction, that his grandmother would have questions he did not know how to answer, that tomorrow every drawing room in Mayfair would be dissecting this moment for meaning and motive. Amelia Brookstone looked at his extended hand as though it were a choice that would define her future, which perhaps it was. Her expression cycled through uncertainty, fear, longing, and finally something that might have been courage or possibly resignation. When she finally placed her gloved fingers in his palm, he felt the slight tremor in her touch, the vulnerability it took for her to accept what he offered, despite knowing it would cost her more than it would cost him. The waltz that followed became, in later years, the subject of much romantic speculation, embellished by people who had not witnessed it and interpreted by those who understood nothing of what actually transpired. The truth was simpler and more profound than any romanticized version. They danced competently but not brilliantly, navigating the figures with adequate skill but no particular grace. They spoke hardly at all, beyond the occasional necessary phrase to coordinate their movements. To any external observer, it might have appeared an ordinary dance between mismatched partners, interesting only because of the disparity in their ranks. But Sebastian felt, with every turn through the ballroom, every moment her hand rested in his, that he was engaged in an act of profound significance he could not yet name. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had taught herself to dance from books and instruction manuals, rather than masters, who had practiced alone in rented rooms and now performed under the scrutiny of 300 people who would judge every misstep. Her courage in accepting his invitation, in allowing herself to be seen and assessed and inevitably dismissed, struck him as more impressive than any calculated social victory he had witnessed. When the music ended, and he returned her to the ballroom's edge where her cousin stood watching with barely concealed shock, Amelia Brookstone curtsied properly for the first time, her movements formal and correct. "Thank you for the dance, Your Grace." "The pleasure was entirely mine, Miss Brookstone." He bowed, released her hand with reluctance that surprised him, and forced himself to walk away before he could say something that would transform speculation into scandal. He danced twice more that evening, with women whose names he immediately forgot, fulfilling his obligation to his grandmother, while his attention remained fixed on the column where Amelia Brookstone had returned to her position of careful observation. She did not look in his direction, did not seek his attention or attempt to capitalize on the notice he had given her. She simply stood, exactly as she had before, as though the dance they had shared had altered nothing fundamental about her position in the world, but Sebastian felt the alteration in himself like a physical weight, uncomfortable and inescapable. He left the ball earlier than planned, citing business that required his attention, which was not entirely false. He had business. He had correspondence. He had 100 obligations that should have occupied his thoughts entirely. Instead, he spent the carriage ride home attempting to understand why a single dance with an unknown woman in a simple muslin dress had accomplished what 8 years of social pressure, political maneuvering, and his grandmother's increasingly pointed observations had failed to achieve, making him question whether the careful isolation he had constructed around his life was protection or prison. Amelia returned to her cousin's house in silence, deflecting Charlotte's excited questions with non-committal responses that revealed nothing of what she actually thought or felt. She prepared for bed with mechanical efficiency, hanging the simple dress in the wardrobe where it would wait for the next obligatory social event she could not avoid. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room that represented the current limit of her circumstances and stared at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that the dance had meant nothing. It was charity, she told herself, or curiosity, or boredom. Dukes did not develop genuine interest in impoverished distant relations of minor gentry based on a single conversation and one unremarkable waltz. Tomorrow he would wake and remember his actual life, his actual obligations, his actual duty to marry someone suitable who could bring alliance and fortune to match his title. She would wake to the same life she had yesterday, dependent on her cousin's generosity, existing in the margins of a society that had no real place for women without fortune or connections, hoping that through some combination of chance and determination she might secure a position as governess or companion that would spare her the final indignity of complete destitution. The dance changed nothing, could change nothing. She knew this with the certainty of someone who had long ago stopped expecting the world to bend toward her wishes. And yet, as sleep finally claimed her in the quiet hours before dawn, Amelia's last conscious thought was of how his hand had felt when it held hers, steady and certain, as though for those few minutes the careful boundaries that governed their respective worlds had ceased to matter. She had allowed herself, for the space of one waltz, to forget that she did not belong in ballrooms where crystal chandeliers cast light bright enough to illuminate every inadequacy. She had allowed herself to dance with a duke who looked at her as though she were someone worth seeing. It was foolish, it was dangerous. It was the kind of indulgence that women in her position could not afford. She had done it anyway. And somewhere across London, in a house grand enough to hold the entire building where Amelia slept, Sebastian Rothwell sat in his study, surrounded by correspondence about Yorkshire drainage, and found himself unable to concentrate on any of it. He kept seeing grey-green eyes that held intelligence without coquetry, kept hearing a voice that spoke truth without calculation, kept feeling the slight tremor in her touch when she had accepted his invitation to dance. He had come to the ball because his grandmother demanded it, but he had stayed, had sought out an unknown woman with no connections worth mentioning, had violated the careful protocols that governed his public behavior, because for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had encountered someone who made him want to stop performing the role of duke long enough to remember what it felt like to simply be himself. It was impractical. It was impossible. It violated every principle of sensible behavior he had cultivated over 8 years of managing impossible responsibilities. He wanted it anyway. The season of 1843 had barely begun, and already it had produced the thing society craved above all else, a mystery worth investigating. By morning, every drawing-room in fashionable London would be speculating about the Duke of Wetherham and his unprecedented attention to an unknown woman in a simple dress. Mothers would evaluate the potential threat. Eligible daughters would reassess their strategies. Gossips would construct narratives from insufficient evidence, spinning elaborate stories about secret engagements and thwarted romance that bore no relationship to actual events. The truth was simpler and more fragile than any of their speculations. Two people had met at a ball neither wanted to attend, shared one dance that followed no particular script, and then returned to their separate lives with the quiet certainty that something had shifted irrevocably, though neither could yet name what it was or what it might become. What happened next would depend on courage neither could be certain they possessed, on choices that would cost more than either anticipated, and on the stubborn insistence that sometimes the heart knows things the mind has not yet admitted. But that reckoning would wait until morning. For now, in the quiet hours between one day and the next, both Amelia Brookstone and Sebastian Rothwell lay awake in the darkness, remembering a dance that had lasted 3 minutes and changed everything. My dear listening friends, before we continue, I want to open my heart to you. Many creators have already stopped telling stories, not because they stopped loving it, but because it became hard to keep going without support. I am still here. I stay because I've built a bond with you, because I know that on the other side someone is listening to feel less alone, to calm their heart, to fall asleep in peace. This channel is not monetized at the moment, but it remains alive thanks to this beautiful connection we've built together. If these stories keep you company, In the pinned comment and in the description, there is a Ko-fi link where you can support with a coffee. Only if you can and if you wish. Every bit of support helps keep this channel alive and allows me to continue creating stories made with care, time, and truth. Thank you for staying with me. Now, let's return to our story. The morning after the Marlborough ball brought rain, and Charlotte's excited chatter about how everyone was discussing the Duke's attention to Amelia. "He crossed the entire ballroom to speak with you," Charlotte insisted. "That must signify something." "He was bored. I was available." "It meant nothing," Amelia replied, though she remembered too clearly the quality of his attention, the peculiar intimacy of dancing with someone as reluctant to perform as she was. "Lady Pemberton mentioned that the Duke's grandmother has been increasingly vocal about his need to marry," Charlotte continued. "Lady Penelope Ashford is rumoured to be the favourite." Each word confirmed what Amelia knew. The Duke would marry someone appropriate. The ball had been an aberration, nothing more. When the knocker sounded just after noon and the maid announced the Duke of Wetherham to see Miss Amelia Brookstone, both women froze in disbelief. Into their modest sitting room walked Sebastian Rothwell, water beading on his greatcoat from the rain, carrying his hat rather than surrendering it to their startled maid. "Miss Brookstone, forgive the intrusion. I was in the neighbourhood and thought I might pay my respects." It was a polite fiction that fooled no one. After introductions, he requested to speak with Amelia briefly. Charlotte nodded mutely, and Amelia followed him to the entrance hall. "You should not be here," she said quietly. "You must know what this looks like." "What conclusions would those be?" "That you have developed some interest in me beyond idle curiosity, that there is significance where none exists, that I am somehow courting your attention rather than being horrified by it." "You are horrified." "I am realistic, Your Grace. You are a duke. I am no one. Your presence here will be noticed and interpreted in ways that will follow me long after you have returned to your actual life. And if I told you I do not care about gossip, then I would say you have the luxury of not caring, which those of us without dukedoms cannot afford." He stepped closer. "Amelia, I am here because I wanted to see you again. I told myself I was being foolish, that one dance was insufficient cause to violate protocol. I came anyway, because last night for 3 minutes I spoke with someone who treated me as though I might be interesting rather than merely titled, and I could not stop thinking about that." Before she could respond, the knocker sounded again. The maid revealed an elegantly dressed woman whose bearing announced her importance. Sebastian's expression shifted. "My grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Wetherham." The Dowager Duchess swept in, taking in the scene with one comprehensive glance. "Sebastian, when you departed claiming business requiring your attention, I did not imagine it involved calling upon young women without proper introduction." After introductions, the Dowager Duchess's tone remained cool. "Tell me, Miss Brookstone, what are your expectations regarding my grandson's attentions?" "I have no expectations whatsoever, Your Grace. I am as surprised by His Grace's visit as you are. If you wish him to depart immediately and never return, I will support that decision wholeheartedly." Something shifted in the Dowager Duchess's expression. "You would genuinely prefer he leave?" "I would prefer not to be the subject of speculation that will define me long after His Grace has returned to appropriate concerns. I am not angling for a position beyond my station." The Dowager Duchess studied her intently. "I came prepared to dislike you intensely. I find instead someone who appears genuinely uncomfortable with being noticed at all. It is disarming." She turned to Sebastian. "We should depart before your presence attracts more attention. Miss Brookstone is correct that your visit will be remarked upon." After they left, Amelia stood processing what had occurred. Charlotte emerged, her face a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "What does this mean?" "I have no idea," Amelia admitted. "But I suspect nothing good can come from a duke developing interest in someone so thoroughly inappropriate." The week following brought unexpected silence. Sebastian did not call again. The gossip eventually exhausted itself. Amelia told herself she was relieved, though relief felt remarkably similar to disappointment. On the 8th day, an invitation arrived. The Dowager Duchess requested Miss Amelia Brookstone's company for tea at Wetherham House. Charlotte insisted on lending her address. The Dowager Duchess does not extend invitations without significance. Thursday arrived with unseasonable sunshine. Amelia approached Wetherham House with her heart hammering, aware she was crossing a threshold that would determine whether this connection could continue. The Dowager Duchess received her with an expression revealing nothing. "I imagine you are wondering why I invited you here. After my grandson's impulsive visit, I found myself reconsidering my assessment. Sebastian has made clear he intends to pursue this connection regardless of counsel. I wish to understand what has captured his attention so thoroughly." Over tea, the Dowager Duchess questioned Amelia about her family, her circumstances, her plans. Amelia answered honestly. Her father had been a poor steward. Debts had consumed their estate. She was seeking employment as governess or companion. "You do not harbor hopes that his interest might lead to something more permanent?" "I would be lying if I said I felt nothing regarding your grandson's attention. But I am not foolish enough to build my future on the assumption that a duke will defy convention for someone of my station. And yet he seems inclined to do precisely that." The Dowager Duchess set down her teacup. "Sebastian has refused 3 separate introductions to eligible young women this week. It is unprecedented behavior. I did not ask him to do any of that, Your Grace." "No, which is perhaps why he persists." She rose. "I have not decided whether to support or oppose my grandson's interest, but I wanted to understand what manner of woman had made Sebastian forget to be sensible about matrimony." As Amelia departed, the Dowager Duchess added, "I will tell you something. Sebastian's father married for political advantage. The marriage was appropriate and profoundly unhappy. I watched my son become isolated, devoted to duty at the expense of everything else. I do not wish to see Sebastian repeat that pattern, but neither do I wish to see him sacrifice security for idealism that cannot survive responsibility. You represent a test of which impulse will prove stronger." That evening, a note arrived from Sebastian requesting she join him for a drive through Hyde Park the next day at 5 o'clock. Charlotte read it and squealed. "He signed it, Sebastian, not Wetherham, and he admitted to thinking about you constantly. You must say yes." Amelia reread the note, her pulse accelerating. If she said yes, she was acknowledging his interest mattered, that she wanted it to continue, and if it proved temporary, she would have allowed herself to hope. But Charlotte's words resonated. "You have spent 2 years preparing for the worst. Perhaps it is time to allow yourself the possibility that something better might transpire." Amelia wrote her acceptance, signed it simply Amelia, and sent it before she could reconsider. The drive through Hyde Park proved easier than she feared. They spoke honestly about difficult things, about loss, about the weight of possessions that represented futures they did not choose, about the performance required of their respective positions. "Why me?" Amelia finally asked. "You could have your choice of any woman in England. Why pursue someone so thoroughly inappropriate?" Sebastian slowed the phaeton. "Because when I speak with appropriate options, I am speaking with women trained to manage performance. The conversations are pleasant and entirely predictable. But when I speak with you, I am speaking with someone who has no investment in performing for my benefit. You can simply be honest, and that honesty makes me want to continue the conversation." A carriage passed carrying Lady Penelope Ashford, whose expression revealed poorly concealed shock and anger. "You are acquiring enemies on my behalf," Amelia observed. "Lady Penelope will redirect her charms elsewhere and succeed. Most marriages in our class are transactions. Whether the individuals develop genuine affection is secondary to whether the arrangement serves practical purposes. And you wish to avoid that pattern. I wish to discover whether it is possible, whether one can be both responsible and genuine." They completed 2 circuits of the Serpentine before Sebastian guided them back toward Amelia's neighborhood. When they arrived, he helped her down, his hands lingering perhaps longer than necessary. "Might you be willing to walk with me in Kensington Gardens next week? You are persistent." "I am determined not to let practicality triumph over possibility without attempting to discover whether the latter has merit." "Yes," Amelia heard herself say, "I would be willing to walk with you." The walk through Kensington Gardens occurred on an afternoon blessed with improbable sunshine. Once in the gardens proper, conversation shifted to something more substantial. I have been thinking about what you said regarding writing, Sebastian began, about how you stopped because imagining better circumstances felt like torture. It is not cheerful conversation for an afternoon walk. But it interests me. Do you think cessation was necessary protection or surrender that was not required? Both, perhaps. I stopped believing anything I imagined could become real. They walked past beds of early roses. I received a letter about the companion position in Somerset, Amelia said quietly. If offered the position, I would depart London within the month. Sebastian's step faltered. What if circumstances changed such that employment became unnecessary? She stopped walking. Are you suggesting what I think you are? I am suggesting that if you were to become my wife, the Somerset position would no longer be relevant. The words shocked her. Sebastian, we have known each other barely 2 weeks. That is insufficient basis for matrimony. Is it? I knew within 3 minutes that you interested me more than anyone I have encountered in 8 years. What would additional time prove? Whether we are actually compatible beyond interesting conversation, whether this is genuine connection or simply novelty that will fade. He stepped closer. Amelia, I am not asking you to decide immediately, but I am asking you to consider whether refusing because of fear is wisdom or surrender. And what are you risking? You retain your position regardless. I risk everything. I risk discovering that the life I thought I should want makes me profoundly unhappy. I risk repeating my father's pattern of appropriate misery. His voice dropped lower. You are not the only one gambling, Amelia. I am terrified, she admitted. So am I. They continued walking, and Amelia felt her defenses fracturing. I need time. This is too significant to decide in a moment. Give me until week's end. Of course, though I hope your consideration leads to the answer I want rather than the answer fear suggests. Amelia spent the next 3 days in internal argument. Part insisted this was the right choice. She cared for him. Marriage would solve her concerns while offering happiness. Another part catalogued ways this could fail. She was unprepared for Duchess obligations. Society would never fully accept her. Sebastian might regret his choice. Charlotte finally confronted her. Something significant occurred. What did the Duke say? He suggested we marry. Charlotte's hand flew to her mouth. After barely 2 weeks? That is extraordinarily precipitous. I am aware, but also extraordinarily romantic. Do you want to marry him? The direct question cut through circular reasoning. Yes, which terrifies me, because wanting something this much makes losing it unbearable. Charlotte took her hand. You cannot spend your life refusing opportunities for fear they might not last. Sometimes you must trust that the possibility of happiness is worth the risk of pain. By Friday evening, Amelia requested Sebastian call Saturday morning. His response arrived within hours. He would call at 10. When he arrived, they sat in the sitting room while Charlotte made herself scarce. You asked me to call, Sebastian said, tension visible despite his steady voice. I hope that signifies you have reached a decision. I have. But before I answer, I need you to understand what you are asking me to risk. If I say yes and this fails, I will be someone who briefly touched a better life and then lost it. That is infinitely worse than never having it at all. Sebastian leaned forward. And if it does not fail, if we build something genuine and lasting, then I will have gambled correctly, but the stakes are not equal between us. I understand, but I am asking you to trust that my interest is genuine and substantial enough to sustain whatever challenges we encounter. Amelia took a breath. I am going to say yes, not because I am certain this will succeed, but because I cannot live with the regret of refusing from fear alone. But promise me that if you begin to regret this choice, you will tell me honestly, rather than maintaining pretense for duty's sake. I promise, and I ask the same of you. Then yes, I will marry you, Sebastian Rothwell. Relief transformed his expression. He took both her hands. You will not regret this, Amelia. Do not make promises you cannot guarantee. Simply try and allow that trying to be enough. When shall we marry? Soon, before I can convince myself I am making a terrible mistake. 3 weeks? 3 weeks seems both impossibly soon and unbearably distant. Charlotte returned with perfect timing. Have you reached an understanding? We are to be married, Sebastian announced, in 3 weeks' time. Charlotte embraced Amelia with enthusiasm. Married to a duke. Sebastian remained for another hour, discussing arrangements. After he departed, Charlotte began making lists with alarming efficiency, while Amelia watched with detachment. She had agreed to marry a duke. In 3 weeks, her life would transform beyond recognition. That evening, dressed in Charlotte's best dinner gown, Amelia entered Wetherham House as Sebastian's acknowledged fiancée. The Dowager Duchess received them in the drawing room. Miss Brookstone, my grandson informs me you have agreed to marry him, despite insufficient time to properly consider implications. Yes, Your Grace. I am aware the decision is precipitous. Precipitous is charitable. Reckless might be more accurate. However, Sebastian assures me his mind is settled. Therefore, I am choosing to accept this situation with as much grace as I can manage. I appreciate your tolerance, Your Grace. Tolerance is not approval, Miss Brookstone, but neither is it active opposition. I will assist with preparations because Sebastian is my grandson. Her expression softened slightly. You will face challenges I cannot fully prepare you for. Society will judge you harshly. You will need thick skin and firm spine. I have survived 2 years of poverty, Your Grace. I am more resilient than I appear. I hope so. Now, practical matters. You will need an entirely new wardrobe. I have made appointments with my modiste for Monday. You will also require instruction in household management, proper protocols. I am prepared to provide that instruction if you are willing. The offer represented the closest to approval Amelia was likely to receive. I would be grateful for any guidance, Your Grace. The dinner proved less intimidating than feared. Sebastian managed conversation with ease, drawing Amelia in naturally. By the time she departed, she felt she had survived without catastrophic failure. The following weeks passed in a blur. The Dowager Duchess subjected Amelia to intensive instruction in everything from household management to proper precedence. The sessions were exhausting and occasionally humiliating, but the Dowager Duchess's manner gradually shifted as Amelia absorbed information with focused determination. You are not stupid, the Dowager Duchess observed during one session. Merely uneducated about matters you have had no reason to learn. That can be remedied with work. The modiste appointments produced a wardrobe of uncomfortable expense. The wedding dress itself was a masterpiece, ivory silk with delicate embroidery, elegant without ostentation. Sebastian visited daily, ensuring Amelia was managing adequately. Their conversations provided anchor points during overwhelming weeks. The engagement dinner 2 weeks before the wedding proved both easier and harder than anticipated. Sebastian's extended family attended, evaluating her with curiosity, ranging from kind to cutting. She survived by being exactly herself, honest about her background, straightforward about limitations, unapologetic about loving their nephew enough to brave judgment. The final week, Sebastian insisted they spend an afternoon alone in the gardens at Wetherham House. After we marry, these become your gardens, he said. You may alter them however you wish. Do you believe your grandmother would disagree that gardens are excessive? My grandmother is learning her preferences. Do not dictate my choices. They found a bench overlooking formal gardens. Are you having second thoughts? Sebastian asked quietly. I am terrified. But that is different from having second thoughts. I still believe this is right, even though right feels impossible. What terrifies you most? That I will disappoint you. That who I am will prove insufficient once you must live with me daily. That I will fail at being the Duchess your family requires. Sebastian took her hand. I chose you precisely because you are who you are. That is considerably more valuable than seamless social performance. The wedding day arrived with brilliant sunshine. Amelia stood before the mirror, seeing a woman in ivory silk who barely resembled herself. Charlotte helped her dress with trembling hands. You look beautiful, like someone who belongs exactly where you are going. The ceremony took place at the Wetherham family chapel. Sebastian's family filled the pews. But Amelia barely registered anything beyond Sebastian at the altar, watching her approach with relief, wonder, and certainty. When she reached him and took his hand, he whispered, "Thank you for being brave enough to do this. Thank you for being persistent enough to make me want to," she whispered back. The ceremony passed in a blur. She promised to honor someone she had known a month. She accepted a ring symbolizing permanent transformation. She became the Duchess of Wetherham. When Sebastian kissed her, brief, chaste, but holding promise, Amelia felt the full weight of irreversibility. There was no undoing this. Whatever came next, she would face it as his wife. The reception confirmed her new life involved obligations she had never imagined. She greeted endless guests, accepted congratulations, navigated conversations with people evaluating her worthiness. Sebastian remained beside her, providing anchor. As evening settled and guests departed, they finally found themselves alone in the library. Amelia sank into a chair with exhaustion. "How are you managing?" Sebastian asked. "I am married to you. I am a duchess. I live in a house that could contain 50 of my previous homes. I am managing by not thinking too carefully about any of it." Sebastian reached across, taking her hand. "You did more than survive. You were remarkable." "I love you," he said quietly, the first time either had spoken the words aloud. "That is why I pursued this, why I ignored every practical objection. I love you too, which is why I agreed despite every instinct toward self-protection. I am hoping love proves sufficient for what comes next. It will be. And when it is not sufficient alone, we will supplement it with patience and humor and stubbornness." They sat in comfortable silence. They had made their choice and would now discover whether it proved wise. They were married. She was a duchess. Everything had changed irrevocably. And in the morning they would begin discovering what their new life actually involved. My dear listening friends, just a gentle reminder. This channel is not monetized right now, but I'm still here because of the connection we share. If these stories bring you comfort or keep you company, the Ko-fi link is in the pinned comment and in the description. Only if you feel like supporting. Your kindness helps keep this space alive. Thank you for being here. Now, let's continue our story. The first weeks of marriage revealed complexities Amelia had not fully anticipated. Being a duchess involved far more than mastering etiquette. It required navigating a social ecosystem with its own rules and unspoken expectations. She woke each morning in a bedroom larger than her father's entire ground floor, attended by a lady's maid who helped with clothing and hair in ways that made Amelia uncomfortable. Breakfasts were formal affairs served in a dining room designed for 20. She was still learning which silver to use, which topics were appropriate, how to manage servants who called her Your Grace, despite being decades older. Sebastian noticed her discomfort. "If you find anything too overwhelming, we can adjust. The household runs adequately without micromanaging. Your grandmother says I need to establish authority early, or servants will take advantage. My grandmother believes firm hierarchy solves all problems. She is not always correct." But Amelia persisted, determined to prove she could manage, despite feeling like she was performing a part inadequately rehearsed. Social obligations proved even more challenging. As the new Duchess of Wetherham, she was expected to participate in constant calls, receptions, dinners. Each involved navigating conversations with women who had known each other for years, who evaluated her worthiness while maintaining polite surfaces. Some were genuinely kind. Lady Catherine Pemberton became an unexpected ally. "I understand what you face," Catherine said during one call. "You have been thrust into a position with no time to prepare, among people who resent that you obtained what they wanted. It is not fair." Other interactions proved less comfortable. Amelia could feel herself being measured, found wanting, discussed later as amusing curiosity or cautionary tale. The breaking point arrived 6 weeks into marriage during dinner at the Duke of Somerset's home. Lady Margaret Thornton made a comment designed to expose Amelia's inadequacy. "It must be quite overwhelming, Your Grace, managing a household so far beyond your previous circumstances. I imagine you find yourself frequently uncertain about proper protocols. "I do find some aspects challenging," Amelia acknowledged. "Fortunately, the Dowager Duchess has been generous with guidance. How fortunate indeed that you secured such an advantageous match, despite lacking preparation most women receive from birth. One might almost call it providential." The implication landed precisely as intended. Amelia felt heat rise, felt judgment pressing against her composure. She should deflect gracefully. Instead, she spoke truth. "I call it terrifying, actually. I wake each morning aware I am inadequate to the position I hold, that I will make mistakes, that I am a constant disappointment to people who believe he should have chosen appropriately. But I love him, and he claims to love me, and we are attempting to build something genuine despite every argument against it. If that makes me presumptuous, I apologize. But I will not pretend I trapped him into marriage he did not want." The silence felt crushing. She had violated some unspoken rule, exposed vulnerability that would be weaponized. Sebastian, seated too far to intervene earlier, finally spoke. "My wife has extraordinary courage, speaking honestly about challenges that would defeat most people. I knew she had not been prepared for this life. I chose her anyway, not despite her honest nature, but because of it. Anyone questioning that decision is questioning my judgment." The dinner never recovered its ease. When they departed, Amelia felt exhausted beyond physical explanation. In the carriage, Sebastian took her hand. "You did nothing wrong. Lady Margaret was deliberately cruel, and you responded with honesty instead of calculated maneuvering. I would rather have a wife who speaks truth. Your preference does not change that I embarrassed us both. Why should you pretend competence you have not had time to develop? That serves no one except people who enjoy watching others struggle. Because that is what duchesses are supposed to do. Project confidence. Make their husbands' lives easier rather than providing fodder for gossip." Sebastian was quiet. "I have made this harder than it needed to be. I was so focused on what I wanted that I did not adequately consider costs you would bear. I should have prepared you better. You cannot protect me from every person who resents that I married above my station. I simply need to develop thicker skin. Or we reconsider how much we expose ourselves to people determined to find fault. There is no law requiring we attend every obligation." They reached Wetherham House and retired to their rooms. After dismissing her maid, Amelia sat at her dressing table, seeing someone who looked like a duchess, but felt like an imposter. Sebastian knocked softly before entering. "I have been thinking about what you said, about waking each morning aware you are inadequate. That strikes me as unbearable. It is simply reality. You are inexperienced, not inadequate. But if you genuinely feel you are failing constantly, we need to reconsider our approach." He settled near her. "Perhaps we can adjust which obligations you prioritize. Focus on aspects that interest you rather than forcing yourself to excel at everything. Find ways to make this life sustainable rather than endurable." "What would adjustment look like?" "You mentioned you used to write stories that pleased you before circumstances made that seem frivolous. What if you allowed yourself that pleasure again, not as escape, but as part of your actual life? Duchesses do not spend time writing stories. This duchess could. Who would it harm?" The idea felt seductive and impossible. Claiming time for creative work when she barely managed obligations seemed selfish. But returning to writing, constructing narratives beyond social judgment, made something in her chest loosen. "I would not know where to begin." Begin where you are. Write what you observe. Use the parts of your position that feel burdensome as material for stories that help you process them. Over following weeks, Amelia tentatively reclaimed space for writing. She began with observations about Wetherham House, gradually expanding into longer narratives. The writing provided unexpected relief, a space where she controlled outcomes, where inadequacies became material rather than shame. Sebastian supported the endeavor without interference. The Dowager Duchess was less immediately supportive, but grudgingly acknowledged Amelia seemed less overwhelmed once she had personal projects. But the larger challenge remained. Amelia's position felt precarious, dependent on Sebastian's support and tolerance from people with numerous reasons to wish she had never entered their world. The situation came to a head 3 months into marriage during a weekend house party. Amelia had dreaded the invitation, 3 days trapped with extended family, unable to retreat when overwhelmed. The first evening proceeded adequately. The second day proved more challenging. The party included several young women who had been candidates for Sebastian's hand. They were not overtly cruel, but their easy familiarity highlighted Amelia's outsider status. Lady Georgiana Hartwell offered to help Amelia with family details that might be confusing for someone new to aristocratic customs, delivered with smiles that landed as condescension. By afternoon, Amelia felt her composure fracturing. She excused herself, claiming headache, and retreated to the small library. Sebastian found her standing at the window. "I saw you leave. Are you managing?" "I am managing by escaping, which suggests I am not actually managing." She did not turn. "Sebastian, I do not know if I can do this. Not just this weekend, but all of it. The constant performance, the perpetual evaluation, knowing I will always be the Duchess who did not deserve her position." He moved beside her. "Tell me what would make this bearable." "I do not know. I thought I could work harder, eventually become adequate. But I'm beginning to suspect no amount of effort will make me truly belong. Not because I lack capability, but because I lack the lifetime of preparation that makes this world feel natural." "Then perhaps we stop trying to make you fit a role you never auditioned for. Perhaps we redefine what being my Duchess means, creating something that works for who you are rather than forcing you into expectations designed for someone else." "Your family would never accept that." "Why not? Who benefits from you exhausting yourself trying to meet expectations that make you miserable? Not me. I married you because of who you are. Not you. You are increasingly unhappy despite best efforts. Not my family. They gain nothing from your suffering. So who are we preserving these standards for?" The question struck something fundamental. She had been so focused on meeting external expectations that she had stopped questioning whether they served any purpose. "I'm afraid that if I stop trying to meet their standards, I will confirm every doubt about my suitability, that you will eventually resent marrying someone who cannot properly fulfill her role." Sebastian took her hands firmly. "Amelia, listen carefully. You cannot destroy what matters about my family through social missteps. The Wetherham name has survived 8 centuries, including scandals, disastrous marriages, and general incompetence. It will survive you being yourself. And if my family's reputation depends on you pretending to be someone you are not, then perhaps that reputation deserves damage." "You say that now. But what happens when society excludes us? When your connections suffer?" "Selective about obligations, choosing events that interest you. It would mean speaking honestly instead of deflecting with polite fiction. It would mean pursuing interests that bring joy. It would mean trusting you are enough exactly as you are." "That sounds remarkably idealistic." "Perhaps. But so was marrying you after 3 weeks, and that proved far more satisfying than any sensible choice. I am proposing we apply the same principle. Choose authenticity over appropriateness, and trust that yields better outcomes." The conversation did not solve everything immediately, but something had shifted. Amelia began declining invitations that would drain her. She spoke more honestly about challenges. She claimed time for writing without apologizing. She stopped trying to be the perfect Duchess and started trying to be herself. The response was mixed. Some were scandalized. Others seemed relieved by her authenticity. The Dowager Duchess cornered Amelia 6 months into marriage. "I have been observing your approach, and I find myself uncertain whether to be concerned or impressed. You are not behaving as duchesses traditionally behave. I apologize if my approach brings dishonor, Your Grace." "I did not say it brings dishonor. I said it is non-traditional. You have chosen authenticity over performance, which is either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. I am withholding judgment until I see whether this proves sustainable." "Does that mean you are not actively opposing my choices?" "It means I am allowing you to discover whether different methods yield acceptable results." Sebastian seems happier than I have seen him since before his father died, which suggests your influence is not entirely negative. By their first anniversary, Amelia had developed routines that made her position feel less like constant performance. She managed obligations with competence born of practice. She maintained connections with people she genuinely liked. She wrote regularly, eventually publishing stories under a pseudonym that garnered modest attention. She had not become the traditional duchess the family might have expected, but she had become someone who could look in the mirror without seeing only inadequacy. The anniversary itself, Sebastian insisted on celebrating privately at a smaller country property in Kent, away from society and obligations. 1 year, Sebastian observed as they walked the grounds. 1 year since you agreed to marry someone you barely knew and trusted that authenticity might sustain where appropriateness would fail. Do you regret it? Any of it? I regret difficulties the marriage created, but I do not regret the marriage itself. You have given me permission to be myself within my life. That is worth every difficulty. Even Lady Margaret's continued commentary. Even that. She provides excellent villain material for your stories. Sebastian laughed. I love you, Amelia Rothwell. Not despite your honesty, but because of it. Not despite your refusal to perform, but because that refusal reminds me authenticity matters more than appearance. I love you too, though I reserve the right to occasionally panic about adequacy. They continued walking through grounds that had become familiar enough to feel like safety. Amelia found herself thinking about how much had changed in 1 year. She had entered marriage terrified that authenticity would prove insufficient. She had believed she needed to become someone different, more polished, more skilled, more appropriate. Instead, she discovered the only sustainable path involved being exactly who she was. It had not been easy, would likely never be entirely easy. But it had been possible. That night, lying in bed, Amelia reflected on the journey from that first dance to this moment. She had been so certain accepting Sebastian's attention would end in heartbreak. That hope would prove insufficient. That authenticity could not survive in a world valuing performance. She had been wrong. Being wrong had led to being happy. Sebastian entered, settling beside her. What are you thinking about? How wrong I was about nearly everything. I was so focused on protecting myself that I almost refused the possibility of happiness. And now I am learning that some risks are worth taking even when outcomes are uncertain. That authenticity is more sustainable than performance, that sometimes improbable choices yield the most satisfying results. Those seem like valuable lessons. They are. Though I wish I had learned them without requiring you to be so persistent. Sebastian pulled her closer. You were not a mistake. You were the best decision I ever made, especially when you were convinced I was being foolish. You genuinely believed I would regret choosing you, and you married me anyway. That took remarkable courage. They lay together in comfortable silence. They had survived, had built something genuine in a world that valued appearance, had proved that authenticity could coexist with obligation. In the morning, they would return to London and resume responsibilities. Amelia would manage household affairs, navigate obligations, continue writing. Sebastian would attend Parliament, manage estates, fulfill duties. But they would do it together, as partners who had chosen each other against practical advice and discovered that impractical choices sometimes yielded extraordinary results. Amelia had attended the Marlborough Ball, certain her future involved employment in Somerset and resignation to limited circumstances. She had left noticed by a duke, which seemed impossible and terrifying. Now 1 year later, she was the Duchess of Wetherham. She managed a household that employed more staff than her childhood village. She navigated social obligations with competence born of practice rather than breeding. She wrote stories that brought her joy and occasional acclaim. She loved and was loved by someone who saw her clearly and valued what he saw. It was not the life she had imagined. It was better because it was real, because it accommodated who she actually was rather than requiring her to become someone else, because it proved that sometimes impossible things became possible if you were brave enough to reach for them. Sebastian had been right. Authenticity was more sustainable than performance. Genuine connection could survive complications that would destroy relationships built on appropriateness alone. And sometimes the greatest courage involved trusting what you felt, despite every practical reason to dismiss it. As sleep finally claimed her on their anniversary night, Amelia's last conscious thought was gratitude. Not for the title or houses or security, though those were significant, but for having been brave enough to say yes when every instinct towards self-protection insisted she refuse. For having trusted, despite insufficient evidence, that what they felt might prove substantial enough to build upon. For having allowed herself to hope when hope seemed the most dangerous indulgence possible. That hope had cost her considerably, had required vulnerability she found terrifying, had demanded she risk devastation for the possibility of happiness, but it had also given her everything that actually mattered: love, partnership, the freedom to be herself without pretense or apology. Some risks, she had discovered, were worth taking even when the odds suggested failure. This had been one of them. And in the morning, when she woke beside the man who had pursued her so persistently despite her protests, she would tell him again that she loved him, that she did not regret the risk they had taken together, that authenticity had proved sufficient foundation for a life neither had imagined but both had built. Because sometimes, against all practical expectations and conventional wisdom, impossible things became possible. All they required was courage enough to reach for them when they presented themselves, and the willingness to trust that being seen, truly seen completely and honestly, was worth the vulnerability that seeing required. Amelia had learned that lesson in a ballroom where she stood alone in a simple dress, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing, resigned to the limitations circumstance had imposed. Sebastian had learned it when he crossed that ballroom to speak with someone who interested him more than duty, obligation, or appropriate choice ever could. Together, they had built something neither could have created alone, a marriage that honored who they actually were rather than who society expected them to be. It was not perfect, would never be perfect, but it was real. And real, they had discovered, was far more valuable than any performance of perfection could ever be. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining me on Amelia and Sebastian's journey from that fateful ball to their first anniversary. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in grand gestures, but in the quiet choice to be vulnerable, to trust, and to believe in possibilities that seem impossible. If this story touched your heart, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe to Echoes of Romance and click the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. I love hearing from you, and your words inspire me to bring you more stories of love, courage, and hope. And if you enjoyed this journey, a like would mean the world to me. Until our next story together, may you find the courage to reach for your own impossible possibilities. With love, Echoes of Romance.